Hi, this is Laylee with In Vivo Leadership Strategies, and this is Integrity Over Scale podcast.
Welcome to Integrity Over Scale podcast. I wanted to do a podcast like this for about 2 years now. We have had so many bad leaders in our society, and it just feels like bad leadership is everywhere. And what I wanted to do was tell the tale of bad leaders. How did they come to power? What really worked? One of the reasons why we kept them around is because something was working, obviously, right? What made them bad leaders, and dive into that. And I want you as a listener to think of this as a cautionary tale, sure, but also as one where you can think about what leadership means to you. And I want us to stop thinking that we need bad leaders in society. That's been the unfortunate myth, is that you have to be hubris to have a higher leadership position to do things. And if we continuously put these types of individuals in offices and companies, then of course they are the only type of people that we can study. If we put better leaders, positive leaders in there, maybe the data will tell us otherwise. So I want to start this series with you all, and I have a leader in mind, and the leader's Rasputin, the mystic who unraveled an empire. So, for those of you who are not familiar with Rasputin, let me start here. A barely literate peasant from Siberia, a man who smelled so strongly that people could tell when he had walked into a building, somehow made himself the most powerful, unofficial figure in the entire Russian Empire. Empresses wrote him letters. Government ministers feared his messages. And when a group of noblemen finally decided to murder him in a palace basement, I believe, the legend says that they had to poison him, shoot him, beat him, and drown him before he would stay dead. His story of death is quite phenomenal. If you haven't, we'll explore it just a little bit. Less than 3 months after he died, the dynasty he had completely helped to unravel was gone forever. 300 years of Romanov rule, the greatest autocracy on earth, collapsed. So this is the story of Rasputin, and it's not really a story about a mystic. It's a story about what happens to powerful people when they become isolated. They are frightened and desperate that their judgment to someone who has absolutely no business holding it. So stay with me, because the warning in this podcast is more modern in terms of lessons than you think it is. So let me start with who he actually was. Let's start with the story of Rasputin. So Grigory Euphemovich Rasputin was born around 1869 in a remote village in Siberia. And I want you to really sit with how unlikely this story is, because the unlikeliness is the whole point. This was a peasant. He had almost no formal education. By most accounts, he actually remained illiterate well into his adulthood. So learning to read and write really came later on in his life. He was rough, very rural, and he was the furthest thing imaginable from the gilded world of the Russian court. And as a young man, after a period of personal crisis and loss of children in infancy, he went through a religious transformation and became a kind of wandering pilgrim, if you will. And this was called Strenik I hope I butchered. I apologize. Traveling across Russia on foot, visiting monasteries, developing a reputation as a holy man, someone with a special spiritual gift. Now, here's something really important, and the most recent scholarship insists on it. Rasputin wasn't a simple con artist who faked his faith from the start. So, historian Antony Beaver, in a 2026 biography of Rasputin, shared that the downfall of the Romanovs paints a genuinely complicated man. So, someone who held real religious feeling and rampant lust at the same time, and sincere spiritual zeal and cynical opportunism side by side. It was in the same body. And the contradiction matters because the most dangerous things that leaders are rarely known for are cartoon villains. They are usually a tangle of mixed, if you will, of genuine and self-serving. And that mix is exactly what makes them so hard to see clearly, and it's so hard to stop it to a point where it becomes that wreckage. And then there was this charisma. Everyone who met Rasputin remarked on it. He had this intense, pale, almost hypnotic eyes and a way of giving a person his complete electrifying attention. So people felt seen by him. They felt that he could look straight into their soul and tell them that they mostly were this and this, and whatever they wanted to hear and needed to hear, he would deliver it to them. Some found him repulsive too. Many found him magnetic too. Almost nobody found him to be forgettable, and that the ability to make people feel chosen, understood, is going to be the engine of this entire story. He rises to power. So how does this happen? Well, Rasputin arrived in imperial capital in St. Petersburg around 1903 to 1905, and the timing couldn't have been more perfect for a man like Rasputin. The Russian aristocracy at that moment was absolutely consumed by a fashion for mysticism, spiritualism, seances, occult, holy man, faith healers. You get the idea. The most powerful people in the country were bored. They were anxious about the future and hungry about spiritual meaning behind why are we here? What are we doing? And into that hunger walked this real, live Siberian holy man with burning eyes and the smell of the authentic peasant. He was really what he was to them was this exotic, thrilling person. He penetrated the court through a network of well-connected noble women who were captivated by him and who passed him upwards, salon by salon, towards the very top. So by the salons, what I mean is salons were not what made him untouchable. What made him untouchable was a little boy. And I'm talking about the Romanovs now. The Tsarina Alexandra, wife of Tsar Nicholas II, had finally, after 4 daughters, given birth in 1904 to an heir, a son, Alexei. And Alexei had hemophilia. It's a genetic disorder that meant that the smallest injury could trigger agonizing and uncontrollable, potentially fatal bleeding. Picture being a mom of this future emperor of Russia and knowing that your child, the heir to 300 years of dynasty, can die from a bruise. And that the court doctors, the finest medicines in the world, could do almost nothing. That is a particular kind of terror, and it had no outlet because the boy's condition was a state secret. Alexandra was carrying the heaviest fear that a parent could carry in that moment, and it was almost entirely alone. And then Rasputin appeared at the bedside, and the bleeding would ease. It seemed to ease, at the very least. Now, we can talk about why, kind of. He likely calmed Alexei, and the calmer child has lower blood pressure and bleeds less. He may have discouraged the doctors from giving aspirin, which we now know thins the blood and would have made things even worse. And there was a sheer power of suggestion and faith and a frightened mother's hope. But here's what matters for our story today. The mechanism doesn't matter to Alexandra. What mattered to her was that this man, and only this man, could save her son. So from that point, in her mind, Rasputin was not a manipulator. He was a living saint that was sent by God and her family's direct line to heaven. And you can't argue someone out of a belief like that, because to attack Rasputin to her was to attack the one thing that was keeping her child alive. And the Tsar, Nicholas II, was, by historical accounts, a weak and indecisive ruler. A kind family man completely by all evidence, but fatally unsuited to absolute power, and also inclined to defer to his wife on anything she felt strongly about. And Alexandra felt about Rasputin more strongly than she felt about almost anything on earth, because again, Rasputin saved her son. So Rasputin stayed year after year and through scandal after scandal, because the two most powerful people in the empire had personal reasons to protect him. That had nothing to do with whether he was good for Russia. And I want you to notice that the warnings were there from the beginning. This wasn't a case of danger no one could see, right? Police reports documented his drunkenness, his womanizing. Members of clergy who had championed him turned against him and denounced him as a fraud and a danger. So senior officials had raised the alarms. There was even an attempt on his life back in 1914 when a woman stabbed him in his home village and very nearly killed him. The scandals were public. The reports were filed. The powerful people around the throne, they could all see what Rasputin was all about. But it didn't matter, because every warning crashed against the same immovable wall. To Alexandra, attacking Rasputin was like attacking the man that was the angel that kept her son alive. So every accusation, no matter how well documented, was reframed in her mind as the work of enemies, jealousy, or persecution of a holy man. So the information was all there. The system simply had no way to act on this. I want you to hold on to that, because it's the most modern thing about this entire story. The failure was almost never a failure of information. It was actually a failure of a system that couldn't act on what it already knew. What made him, Rasputin, so effective, and why that is the scary part, was this. I want to slow down here, because we have to understand what Rasputin was actually good at. And it's more uncomfortable and more relevant to us as far as 2026 goes. There's a concept in leadership and leadership research that maps onto Rasputin almost perfectly. Researchers who study charisma Going back to the work of scholars like Jane Howell, Robert Howes, they draw a crucial distinction between two kinds of charismatic leaders. There's a socialized charismatic who uses their gift to empower other people and serve a collective good. And then there is the personalized charismatic who uses the exact same magnetic gift to serve themselves, to build dependence, and also satisfy their own needs for power and adoration and control. Same charisma, completely opposite in terms of purposes. And the tragedy is that from the outside, when you and I look at it, in the early days, they can be very hard to tell apart because both of them make you feel amazing. Both of them make you feel seen. Rasputin was a master of the personalized kind. His genius was emotional intimacy. He could create very quickly this feeling that he understood you completely, that there was a sacred private bond between you two, and that no one else could ever touch it. And he paired that intimacy with an aura of total, unshakable divine certainty. So in a court that was drowned in anxiety, here's a man who never seemed to doubt, who spoke as though he completely had a direct line to God. And it was God's plan. So to a terrified, isolated woman, that combination, I see you completely, and I'm absolutely certain, wasn't a manipulation. It was like oxygen to her. And that's a lesson I never want you to forget about this episode. The most dangerous influence rarely feels like manipulation to the person being influenced. It feels like being finally deeply understood. It feels like a relief. So when I work with leaders and we talk about the people who have outsized sway over them, I'm never just asking, is this person competent? I am asking, why does it feel so good to listen to them? And what need in me are they meeting? Because the need is the doorway. And that is the doorway that's used every single time. Now, you can argue that a manipulative holy man, Rasputin, at court, is a scandal, but not a catastrophe. So how did this man become a catastrophe? This is where we see the bad leadership and the turn of events. Rasputin never held an official position. Wow. Not one. He was not a minister, not a general, not an advisor with a title, but from roughly 1915 and onward, he wielded this extraordinary informal power over the actual government of Russia. Now, as someone who's sitting on the outside, I am super impressed. I have credentials up the wazoo, and sometimes I feel like people can't hear me. And here's this man with a completely poor background walking into this situation, and look at the influence that he had. The way it worked was a chain. Rasputin would make a recommendation, often about who should be appointed or dismissed from a high office. He would pass it to Alexandra, who trusted him as the voice of God, and then Alexandra would press it on Nicholas, who deferred to her. So a Siberian peasant with no office and no qualification was, in effect, helping to staff the government of a nation that was at war. And the timing here, again, is everything, because it intersects with one of the worst leadership decisions of the entire era. So in 1915, during the First World War, with the Russian army suffering terrible defeats, Tsar Nicholas made this catastrophic choice to personally take command of the armed forces and then leave the capital for military headquarters at the front. Think about what that did. First, it attached his personal prestige directly to every single military failure from then on. And when the army lost, the Tsar lost personally. Second, it left the entire domestic government of the empire effectively in the hands of Alexandra, which meant functionally in the hands of the man whispering in Alexandra's ear. And the results were genuinely devastating. Competent ministers, they were dismissed, replaced sometimes within weeks based on whether they had pleased or offended Rasputin's circle. The turnover became so absurd and so rapid that it earned its own mocking name at the time. They called it the ministerial leapfrog. In the space of a couple of years, Russia churned through interior minister, war minister, prime minister, and a pace that made coherent governance impossible. You can't run a country, let alone a country fighting for its life in a war, world war, when the people running the ministries are swapped left and right like cards because the moods and the grudges of an informal favorite says so. The government didn't just become bad, it became functionally ungovernable. And here's what I want you to think about as we continue on this story in a leadership way. Rasputin didn't destroy Russia by seizing power. He destroyed it by corrupting the people who already held it. He never stormed a palace. He never commanded an army. He actually just got close enough to the real decision makers, met their deepest emotional needs, and then slowly hollowed out their judgment from the inside until the institution they were supposed to be running fell apart around them. That is a kind of damage that doesn't require a title. It only requires access and dependence. And that should make every leader listening sit up, because access and dependence are everywhere. Now, I want to complicate the story even more, because the best leadership lesson that lives is the complication. And because I promise you a well-researched episode, not a fairy tale. And the recent serious scholarship pushes back hard on a lot of that. So Douglas Smith, he wrote the 2016 biography of Rasputin, and Faith, Power, and Twilight of Romanovs is considered a definitive scholarly account in English. Spent an enormous amount of separating the documented facts from centuries of myth. And then Antony Beaver, in his new 2026 book, went even further and made a genuinely proactive argument that I think is going to be very interesting for this whole episode. Beaver argues that a huge amount of damage Rasputin caused wasn't done by what he actually did. It was actually done by people, what people believed he did. The rumors, the wild stories that he was sexually involved with the Empress and even her daughters, and it appeared to have been completely untrue. The conspiracy theories that he was a German agent steering Russia to defeat. And his point is that those rumors, if they were true, if they were not true, did real historical work. They destroyed the credibility of the monarchy in the eyes of the public and the army. So by the time the revolution came, the throne had been so discredited by the swirl of Rasputin rumors that, as Beaver shares, almost no one was willing to lift a sword to defend the Tsar. This is very unsettling, because the perception became more powerful than the reality. Whether he was a monster or merely a deeply flawed man, and an opportunistic man, as we have learned historically speaking, the fact that everyone believed the worst and acted on that belief. And Beaver explicitly draws the line to our own era, where myth and rumor can move events more powerfully than the truth. That is the warning underneath the warning of this story. So as a leader, you're not only responsible for what's true about your leadership, you're also operating inside what people believe is true. And when an organization loses control of that perception, when the story about the leadership curdles, the institution can collapse even if the literal facts are more innocent than the legend. And I promised you to talk about the famous death. So the legend says the assassins, a group of nobles that were led by Prince Felix Yusupov, I apologize if I'm mispronouncing words, fed him poisoned cakes and wine that did nothing, and then shot him, and then kept reviving, and then had to shoot him again, and finally drown him in an icy river. It's an unforgettable story. It's also, according to actual autopsy and careful historians, a large myth. So the autopsy found gunshot wounds, including a fatal shot to the head, and little evidence for the poison or the dramatic resurrection or the drowning. The legend of the man who would not die was in large part manufactured afterward, much of it by Yusupov himself, who had every reason to make his own deeds sound heroic and supernatural. So the myth-making didn't stop when his heart did. And that is almost too perfect for a symbol for the entire phenomenon. So, okay, we have the story. We have what historians have said. Let's do the part that makes this leadership episode more of a leadership episode and not just a history lecture for you. Let's give this a precise vocabulary, because naming a pattern is the first step in defending against it. The leadership scholar by the name of Barbara Kellerman, of Harvard's Kennedy School, wrote a landmark book in 2004 simply called Bad Leadership: What It Is, How It Happens, and Why It Matters. And one of the most useful things she did was insist that bad leadership is not just one thing. We tend to lump it all together. But Kellerman laid out 7 distinct types, and they're worth knowing. So briefly, she names the incompetent leader who lacks the skills or will to act effectively. There's the rigid leader who is unyielding and can't adapt. There's the intemperate leader who lacks self-control. The callous leader who is uncaring towards the needs of others. And then the corrupt leader who lies, cheats, and steals and puts their self-interest ahead of the common good. We have the insular leader who disregards the welfare of anyone outside of their own small circle. And then finally, we have what we know very well in our society called evil leader, who uses power to inflict real harm. Now, where does Rasputin sit in here? I want to talk about that, because I would put him most cleanly in the corrupt category, and the fit, it feels precise. So we'll go with corrupt. Kellerman's corrupt leader places personal gain ahead of the public interest. And that is Rasputin. He pursued personal influence, material comfort, and by many credible accounts, sexual gratification, all of it draped in the robes of spiritual authority. So the holiness was at least in part the cover for the appetite. That is the textbook corruption in Kellerman's sense, the betrayal of a trust for private benefit. I want to add another layer because I think it makes the analysis richer and more honest. Kellerman's insular type fits the story too. But if we are practicing more about the definition, the insular belongs as much to the Romanov court as it does to Rasputin. So insular leader is one who walls themselves off and disregards the wider world that they are responsible for. And that is Nicholas and Alexandra to a devastating degree. They were so sealed inside of their private world and their fears, their love for their son and so forth, that they lost all contact with the suffering of their people. The council of competent officials, the political reality of their country falling apart. And Rasputin didn't create that insularity. He found it. He fed on it. He deepened it. And he was the corruption that thrived because the leadership was already insular. And that points us at one of the richest questions in the whole story. The one I want you to chew on. Was Rasputin even a leader at all? He had no authority. He only had an influence. So is he a bad leader? Or is he a bad advisor who exploited bad leaders? And I don't want to say I have an exact answer, but after sitting with this for a while, is that the distinction is exactly the trap. We obsess over the org chart, over titles, reporting lines in the modern world, and we assume that there's a power there. That's where the power is. That's where the authority is. But real power flows through influence and dependence, and it doesn't care what the org chart says. Rasputin proves in the story that the most consequential figure in an institution can be someone with no formal role, accountable to no one, and not even visible on a diagram. If your model of leadership in your mind and the definition that you have only looks at people with titles, you will never see the Rasputin in the room until it is completely too late. And why didn't anybody stop him? That is the question that haunts this entire story, and it will haunt all the future stories that we talk about in this podcast. It's the most useful part for the two of us. The court was full of intelligent, powerful, and well-connected people. Sure, many of them could see exactly what was happening. So why did it take years and finally a murder before anyone effectively acted? Well, the answer is a masterclass in how destructive influences survive, and research here is excellent. Maybe. There's a framework I love for exactly this kind of situation. And it's developed by researchers Art Padilla, Robert Hogan, Robert Kaiser, and they call it toxic triangle. Here's what I mean. Their core insight is that destructive leadership is never just about the bad leader. It always takes three things working together. One is a destructive or flawed leader. So that's one. Two, susceptible followers. Okay. And three, a conducive environment. So take away any one of the three, and the whole thing usually fails. Rasputin is a very good illustration of all three locking into place at once. Let's start with the susceptible followers, because Padilla and his colleagues really made a sharp distinction here. Some followers go along out of fear and self-interest, and they call those conformers. And some go along because the leader's vision genuinely meets their needs and they actively promote him. Those are the colluders. Alexandra was the ultimate colluder. Rasputin was not exploiting a weakness in a wicked person. He was meeting this desperate, sympathetic, entirely human need of a mother that wanted to save her child. That's what made this entire story unstoppable and brought his defense every time. The most loyal protectors of a destructive figure are very much and often not bad, terrible human beings. They're people whose deepest needs are there, and they figure that this leader is going to meet it. And that's precisely why appeals to evidence bounce off of them. You're not arguing with logic at that point with them. You're arguing with their hope, with their faith. Then there's a conducive environment. This is the third leg of the triangle. So think about Imperial Russia. They couldn't have been more conducive if it had been designed in a lab. You had an absolute autocracy with essentially no checks and balances, no real accountability, no mechanism for the system to correct a bad call at the top. You had the instability and existential threat of a catastrophic world war. You had a secret at the heart of the family of this boy's illness that walled off decision makers from scrutiny. Destructive influence flourishes in exactly these conditions: instability, perceived threat, absence of the checks and balances, where there are no guardrails and the personalities at the top become everything. And the personalities at the very top had handed their judgment to a mystic. Don't you like if for those listeners who are not seeing my hand, I'm doing a little mystic hand. And then let's go layer it on top of all of this. And layered on top of all of it, classic groupthink. The phenomenon that psychologist Irving Janis named and studied. It's a tight, insulated, high-pressure inner circle, fiercely loyal, deeply distrustful of outsiders, that closes ranks and treats any challenge to Rasputin as an attack on the family itself. So in that kind of sealed group, the people who could see the truth either stayed silent to keep their access or got pushed out for speaking up, which only made the bubble even more sealed. So the warnings wouldn't come in. The system had no way to hear the very people trying to save it. Now, I don't want to leave you with this impression that nobody spoke up, because some people did. And what happened to them, it's really its own lesson. So in 1916, the desperation had reached the floor of Duma, which is a Russian parliament. And in a speech that became famous across the country, the politician Pavel Milyukov listed the government's catastrophic failures one after another. And then after each one, he asked a single devastating question: is this stupidity or is this treason? He was pointing straight at the circle around the throne, straight at Rasputin, the influence in public, and naming it. And around the same time, right-wing politician named Vladimir Purishkevich was a monarchist who loved the throne and was horrified by what he saw destroying it. He stood up, denounced the whole rotten dynamic in a blistering speech. And here's the dark irony. He was so convinced that words would not work that he went and joined the conspiracy to murder Rasputin with his own hands. Think about what that tells you. The honest voices existed, but the only avenues left for them were speech that the throne ignored and a murder that solved nothing. That is what happens in a leadership system with no legitimate channel for dissent. Truth-telling gets pushed all the way to the extremes, to public denunciation, and then finally to violence, because the normal, healthy way that you and I can solve things for anybody is completely misled, and I don't feel heard, and it's completely broken down. And that's the bridge to your world, isn't it? The leadership researcher, Amy Edmondson, spent her career showing that the single biggest predictor of whether an organization can catch its own problems is psychological safety. It's when people believe they can raise a hard truth without being punished for it. The Romanov court had zero psychological safety around the subject. So for you, if you question Rasputin, was a risk to your position, whatever you had access to, sometimes your career. So the people who knew what the risk was, they went quiet. If the only people willing to tell the truth in your organizations are the ones that are willing to torch their careers to do it, don't have a courage problem. You have a system problem. And you are closer to the Romanov court than you think. I want to bring this more into our world because I didn't choose Rasputin because the story is wild, although it's very wild. And some of it is like, is it true? Is it not true? So I just wanted it to really sink in with some of the wording that we hear in today's world. I chose him because the pattern that I see today follows this almost everywhere. And most of us have a Rasputin somewhere in our orbit. And they could be wearing a much better suit and maybe smelling a little bit better. Maybe they're using cologne. But I want you to think about an organization that you know. The unaccountable advisor who has the founder's ear and somehow shapes every major decision while they hold no formal responsibility and they probably are not in any org chart. Hey, the consultant who maybe stepped into your world, and I know I'm a consultant, so I kind of hate that I use that as an example, but they become so personally indispensable to an anxious executive that no one can question them anymore, because the question that you have in why is this consultant here and it's not the right person is to question the leader who trusts them in the first place. The charismatic guru figure a frightened company brings in during a crisis, and they offer total certainty when everyone else is offering hard trade-offs. This is a person who slowly becomes the real power behind the throne. So the influential voice in a leader's ear, the friend, the whisperer, the person with a private access to the leaders, they can steer the outcome and it can affect thousands of people while answering to no one. These are our Rasputins. And it's not because they're mystics, but it's because they hold real power through dependence. If there's a word you walk out of today in this episode, is dependence. It's access. It's no accountability that's attached. And the conditions that let them flourish are the same three legs of toxic triangle we just talked about every single time. A leader who's frightened, who's isolated, who is desperate, that's your susceptible follower. If you have an environment that's under threat with weak guardrails and no real check and balance power that's on top, that's your conducive environment. And a person who's charismatic and very certain, who meets the leader's emotional needs so well that the loyalty overrides judgment, feedback. When you see all these three, you're not just looking at a personality quirk of someone. So-and-so, that's just how they are. You're actually looking at a system that is one bad season away from a Rasputin. Yeah, I just made that Rasputin from a Rasputin. So, what do you actually do with this? A few things, and I want to make sure that I'm practical because my company's in vivo leadership strategies where behavior, right? We want action. So first, build the guardrail before you need them. The single greatest protection against destructive informal influence is a culture where decisions face real scrutiny. People are accountable, where people are safe, where no one, titled or not, is beyond a hard question. So think about that. Second, watch the dependence. There's that word I love again, including your own. The most honest question you as a leader can ask is there anyone in my orbit I have made myself unable to question, and why? If the honest answer is that challenging them feels disloyal or unthinkable, that's not a sign of how trustworthy they are. That's your warning light. And third, pay attention to perception and not just the truth. So remember, Beevor, Antony Beevor, the story people believe about your leadership can sink you even when the facts are kinder than the legend. Silence, secrecy, let the rumors win. I'm not saying some of it was false or truth. I'm saying the perceptions were there in the story. Transparency is a defense. It's not a virtue, according to the story. A little more word about the work, because this is exactly the kind of work I do with leaders in vivo leadership strategies. And if this is the episode that's hurting a nerve, I want you to know there's a way to go deeper on it. Almost nobody is the star in their own mind. We're all reasonable ones. We're all perfect in our best way, which is exactly why these patterns are so hard to see from the inside. The dependence that has quietly grown too strong is one that we often don't see. We may not be questioning the right people. And the story about leadership is that getting away from you can have your heads down, you could be working super hard and not see what's going on with you or what's going on in your company, your culture. So a good coach is a person outside your sealed circle who is willing to ask the questions your inner circle may have stopped asking. So when people ask me, why would I need a leadership coach? It's because a leadership coach, especially trained, especially if they're ICF trained, they know how to ask questions to get you to a deeper truth. There's a lot of what I do. I help leaders see the dynamics they are too close to see and then build the guardrail that keeps the good judgment from quietly slipping away. If that is the kind of clear-eyed partner you have been wanting, reach out to me. You can subscribe to my podcast. You can find me at invivoleadershipstrategies.com. And there's a link there if you want to have real conversations with me, you can contact me. I'm happy to connect. I'm happy to discuss. Before I distill the warning, I want to hand you 4 questions to carry outside of this episode, because the stories are only worth telling if they change how you look at your own situation. Pause and really reflect on your actions. So 1, what does Rasputin reveal about your own vulnerability as a follower? We can always cast ourselves as the one who would have seen things, but think about that question. 2, why did intelligent, powerful people fail to stop this? And where is that same dynamic in your organization? You already know the answer that I gave about Rasputin, but think about your own organization. 3, is a troubling figure in your orbit a bad leader or a bad advisor exploiting weak leadership? This is a very important question to understand where the source of truth is coming from and where is the source of perception. And then 4, what modern parallel are you living inside right now? Think about that. So, what is the warning of Rasputin in the end? Let me gather all of this up because it's been a long podcast. The first warning is that most dangerous influences don't feel like manipulation, it feels like you're understood. The second warning is that power doesn't live in the org chart. So, most consequential figures in an institution, they can be someone with no title, no accountability at certain times. And then third, warning is that destructive influence always takes three things, not one: a flawed figure, susceptible follower, and a conducive environment. Usually can't change the charismatic personality, but you can absolutely work on the other two. Fourth warning, the one from Anthony Beaver that I cannot stop thinking about, is the perception part. That the perception can become more powerful than the truth. The legend can do the damage that the man could never do, which means leading well is not only doing it right, but it's also not losing control over the story, because an institution can collapse under a myth. So thank you for joining me for the very first warning tale of a bad leader. If you found this valuable, again, share it with someone, follow the podcast, subscribe, whichever platform you're using. And we have a weekly episode that I offer here as well. If you ever want to go deeper, follow me and find me at invivoleadershipstrategies.com. Until next time, live your life in vivo.